Hey everyone, welcome to NE517 Romans, study of the letter to the Romans based on the English text, English translation. It's an influential letter, as you all know, that has affected not just what we think of as theology or church practice or doctrine. Romans has been a letter because of the influence of Christianity, especially by Euro-American white people who have been Christians. Romans has been a letter that has influenced our political and social structures. Some of our kind of intuitions about psychology, about body and mind, basic things like that. So I'm glad to welcome you to a course that's going to be wrestling with some really large questions, part of a really influential legacy. And that means that we're going to be, not pretending to avoid the history of interpretation or thinking that we can sort of get Romans right once and for all. We're going to be joining a conversation, a history of interpretation, and trying to be mindful of some of the assumptions and tendencies that we have inherited, and not to pretend that those aren't influencing us, but then to read the text critically ourselves and to engage the traditions of interpretation that influence our understanding critically. We want to engage those asking hard questions and questioning them. So that's the kind of course that you're in for. I'm going to use this intro video to talk a little bit about some of the main emphases of the course, start here in a minute with some logistics. Let me just say first that I've taught this course a number of times, and it's one that I really enjoy teaching at Fuller because there's a lot of sort of experience, I suppose, of those aha moments that come with studying a letter like this, maybe seriously for the first time for some of us. Logistically, just want to urge you to read the syllabus carefully, and you're going to want to pay special attention to the tentative course schedule that I have at the end of the syllabus, because that's going to tell you what you're responsible for each week. It includes hyperlinks to required readings, as well as some recommended readings sometimes, so that those are quickly accessible to you. And then what's not listed there but is assumed is that you are working with two commentaries on Romans that the syllabus tells you about. One from two different sets of choices that you have. One commentary that's a little bit more kind of typical, nuts and bolts, a little more technical perhaps. And then another set of commentaries to choose from where you'll have one that's a little more pastorally oriented, maybe dealing with some wider kind of systematic sorts of questions that the kind of verse by verse technical commentary often will not address as well. And we're going to be sort of talking about some of the advantages and disadvantages of these different approaches to interpreting Romans, because, as I'll say more about in a minute, I have a lot of worries about the way that the letter has been fragmented in the way that it is read. And that fragmentation is aggravated in some ways by the structure of commentaries, sort of treating the text bit by bit. Rest of this video, I want to just talk briefly about three emphases of the course that will be thematic, and telling you about them now, I think, helps you to get a sense of where I'm coming from, some of the concerns that animate me as a professor, as a teacher, and help you see kind of how the course fits together that way. The first emphasis of this class is going to be on reading Romans as having staged rhetorical purpose. Let me say what I mean by that. Romans is one single argument, has a beginning, a middle, and an end, even though we don't often read it that way. But along the way, the letter has stages that it's moving through, stages of its argument. And what Paul is saying with his words in each one of those stages is driving at a particular purpose. Studying the letter carefully can help us identify what that purpose, what that concern, what that burden is at each stage. And that's really critical to interpreting the letter well. If we lose sight of what the most direct purpose of Paul is and what he's saying, then we will tend to read the words according to a general frame of reference that we have about Christian doctrine or something that's a pet peeve of ours, something that we really care about, and not really be tracking with what, why Paul is saying what he is saying. Case in point would be that familiar verse in Romans in chapter 3, where Paul says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." And this is something that a lot of us have grown up hearing from Romans, and we assume that Paul's purpose there is simply to reinforce for his audience that everybody is a sinner and therefore needs God's grace in Jesus to be saved. Well, that is not quite why Paul says that all people have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. He's actually, in that part of the letter, as we'll see when we get there, combating a certain tendency to boast. And in the context of Romans, this is a matter of some people tending to claim authority, power for themselves among the communities that he's writing to, based upon certain credentials that they understand themselves to bring to the community and to entitle them to positions of power and influence. And Paul is saying in this stage of Romans 3 that the way that the power of sin affects the human actually makes it impossible for human beings to play judges over one another, whether as persons or as communities. God has not, in fact, authorized one community or one person with certain credentials to rule over others. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So you can hopefully hear there that the rhetorical purpose is a little different from simply trying to persuade the audience that they're all sinners. There's a more immediate concern that Paul has in terms of what sin does to the ability of human beings to exercise authority or power over one another, to judge one another, and to boast in credentials, especially credentials that are sort of visible, you might say, in the way that their life, their body is presented. Paul wants to oppose that and show how the gospel has revealed that not to be true, and instead a different way for people to understand how they're related to one another and how they receive power for good living together in their life. So that's going to be the first emphasis, is time and time again, tracking with the rhetorical purpose of what Paul's argument is at each stage, and trying to clarify that and use that to make sense of some of the difficult sentences, paragraphs that we're going to find in the letter. Not incidentally, that's going to help us sort of hear what Paul is saying as pastoral, as exhortation, as urging us, as speaking to us, and not simply stating kind of flat doctrines whose pastoral purpose is left unclear and for us to kind of come up with. Second emphasis I've already hinted at, and that is that we're going to read Romans as a whole letter, as opposed to reading it as just a collection of kind of fragmented passages or sentences or whatever. And that means that we're going to be starting at the beginning of Romans and reading through it stage by stage all the way to the end, so that we are building a sense of what its cumulative message is and how later parts of the argument depend on what Paul has said earlier in the argument, and making that a part of our interpretation as well. This is not customary in a lot of biblical interpretation, especially in a lot of evangelical contexts where we have emphasized sometimes memorization of scripture or turning scripture into certain slogans. And we forget that where we're drawing these scriptural words from is actually particular literary works that have characteristics, certain qualities to them as the literary works that they are, whether narratives or letters or apocalyptic visions, in this case, a letter. And so we're going to try to work according to the second emphasis at reading the letter beginning to middle to end, asking ourselves how the argument is building, how what Paul has said to a certain point helps us to understand what he means at the point that we're now, say, studying. And part of this too will be connecting parts of the letter that we've sometimes allowed to become totally remote from one another. So, for example, at the beginning, Paul is arguing, as I've already been suggesting, against a certain kind of human judgment or rule, some over others. And we don't hear a lot about judgment after the first few kind of stages of the letter. But then suddenly in chapter 14, when Paul begins to address specific pastoral concerns about how people are sharing the table with one another, we get this explosion of that same terminology of judgment. So that it turns out that Paul was already laying the groundwork for what he was going to say pastorally and directly about the practice of the community at the end of the letter, with what he's saying about judgment at the beginning of the letter. So we want to be able to make those connections. And again, that's going to be something that helps us discern the living force of the letter, as opposed to thinking that Paul is just talking about abstract problems or something at certain stages of Romans. So that's the second emphasis, reading the letter as a whole. Third emphasis is also something that I've been hinting at already, and that is that we're going to read Romans hopefully with an ear for what its pastoral edge is. And here I probably want to add what its political edge is. That is how it's directing us, how it is speaking to us, how it has the force of a kind of imperative, a call to us. This is something that is hard for some of the reasons that I've already highlighted, but it's hard also because often in the study of the Bible in our time, we assume that the first task of interpretation is to reconstruct what a book or what words of the New Testament say meant a long time ago in its original context. And that can sort of consume us so much. We're reconstructing what the letter once meant that it's almost like we never get around to saying how this calls to us today, or we have to make a lot of seemingly arbitrary moves to try to get from that ancient remote context to what feels like something near and urgent in our own. I don't want to neglect the historical origins of Romans. We're going to read and talk about some of that kind of initial context in which the letter was written and that it was addressing. But my approach is not to assume that interpretation is first and foremost about reconstructing an ancient meaning. I take those questions that we ask about its initial context to already be implicating us, our imagination, our tendencies, our hopes, our fears, so that we're always doing, I think, present day interpretation, even when we ask about past contexts. And that means that in the way that we read the letter, we're not going to be thinking about the ancient context as utterly remote from our own. There are, of course, differences, but I think that all of those differences have analogies in our own time, our own concerns. And so we'll be looking to describe the concerns of the letter and then to interpret what it says with an ear for how it is speaking to us. And I think that if you do a good job kind of interpreting the letter in a way that is not too cliche, not too canned, is kind of tracking with its rhetorical purpose, keeping in mind what Paul is saying about his audience, how he's addressing his audience, that we will almost naturally feel the pressure of the letter, of our interpretation of the letter on our lives. So there won't be always this like really kind of official turn from, you know, what the letter meant to its original audience to application today or something like that. I think that there's a little bit more fluidity going on, in fact, between the moments of the letter. And this gives me a chance to say one last thing about this emphasis, and that is that I don't really buy into any easy distinction between spiritual matters and, you know, what we might call material matters or everyday life matters or something like that. Nor do I buy into a neat kind of distinction between what is pastoral and what is political, by which I mean what has kind of public force and public meaning, not just something sort of specific to each individual or their spirituality, or even uniquely and only to the church community. But I take Romans to be giving us teaching that is about how God is present in the world, shaping us, working among us and in us. And that has all kinds of implications for how we exercise power, how we share power, how we share wealth, how we live our lives economically. A whole variety of concerns that I think are rightly understood now as political, whether they relate to a particular political campaign or the political system that we happen to be living in, wherever we are in the world. I just mean that Romans is about something that has public implications for the way human beings live in community and society with one another. Not something that is confined primarily to a spiritual realm or the religious or something like that. So you're going to hear that coming out in the course. I think that Romans has something to say to us about white supremacy. I think Romans has something to say to us about all kinds of justice issues. The whole theme of the letter arguably is the justice of God as it is revealed in the gospel about Jesus. So that's the third emphasis, is just the intrinsically pastoral and political force of Paul's letter to the Romans. Let me say one last thing to close, and that is about the assignments of the class. You will see from the syllabus that the bulk of the work for this class is really in the week to week. There's a significant amount of reading, textual study, where you're using a couple commentaries as your dialogue partners. And you have a session assignment, a reading report that you're submitting each week. So it's really important to have a good rhythm of work to keep up with the pace of the class. And it's not going to be until the second half of the course, week 6, where you're submitting for peer review first an interpretive working paper on a particular passage of Romans. That's your first formal assignment. And then the second and last formal assignment will be an advanced interpretive paper, which you'll also submit for peer review before submitting to me and the TAs for grading. And that advanced interpretive paper will be on the same passage that you studied for the interpretive paper, but another level of kind of sophistication and development in your interpretation of the letter. So we'll obviously be talking more about those formal assignments when we get to them, but I just want you to know now that there's only those 2 formal assignments. They come in the second half of the course, so that to do well in this course, you really want to commit yourself to a regular pattern of keeping up and, doing your due diligence week in and week out, well before we get to those formal assignments. And of course, that is partly what's going to help you do well in those formal assignments. Looking forward to studying with you this term and to interacting with you in the forums. Eventually, we'll be doing some video conferences and whatnot as well. Welcome to the course.